Have you ever found yourself just, well, drowning in information, sort of overwhelmed by complexity and just wishing for a clearer path, a shortcut maybe?
Oh, absolutely. That feeling of wanting to cut through the noise,
Yeah,
find the simplest route.
exactly. Or maybe you've just had that gut feeling that, often the simplest explanation is actually the right one. Less is more kind of thing.
It's a really fundamental desire, isn't it? To
Right.
strip away all the unnecessary stuff, get down to the basics, the real essence.
It really is. And today we are diving deep into the mind of someone who championed exactly that, a truly revolutionary thinker from the Middle Ages.
Right.
His ideas about simplicity didn't just stay theoretical. They fundamentally reshaped how we think about knowledge, reality, even power itself. We are, of course, talking about William of Ockham.
Ah, Ockham. A name most people know for the razor, probably, but his overall impact is often, I think, really underestimated.
Totally underestimated. So in this deep dive, our mission is really to unpack Occam's, well, pretty radical ideas. We want to trace his journey, quite an extraordinary one, from this, obscure village in Surrey, England,
Mhm.
to becoming this huge intellectual figure who just wasn't afraid to challenge the biggest established norms of his time, a very tumultuous era.
It really was.
And we'll explore how his insights, which can sometimes be misunderstood, actually still resonate today, offering surprising clarity even for our, let's face it, incredibly complex modern world.
So the goal is to find those key nuggets of his thought.
Exactly. To distill those nuggets, giving you a solid, comprehensive grasp of this pivotal figure, someone whose legacy is definitely still alive and kicking.
And for this exploration, we're leaning heavily on William of Ockham, the scholastic innovator,
All right.
using excerpts from that as our main guide.
That's the plan. It's our core resource for navigating this fascinating journey. So, okay, let's set the scene. Occam. He lived when exactly? Late 13th, mid 14th century.
That's right. Think late 1200s into the mid-1300s. And it wasn't just any period. Europe was undergoing this intense transformation. Less stable, more seismic, as you said earlier. Old ways were definitely being questioned.
Seismic is a good word for it. New ideas bubbling up everywhere, challenging everything.
And central to this was the rise of the universities. Places like Oxford, where Ockham himself studied, became these incredible hubs of intellectual energy. This period was really the peak, the absolute zenith of what we call high scholasticism.
Right, high scholasticism. And I think sometimes people hear scholasticism and picture something really dry and,
Right.
dusty.
Yeah, academic in the boring sense.
But it wasn't like that at all, was it? It was this incredibly rigorous, thematic, honestly quite ambitious intellectual project.
Totally ambitious. The core idea was to weave together logic, theology, and philosophy into one massive, coherent system, like understanding everything.
And the main influence was Aristotle, rediscovered, brought back into the mainstream.
Yes, synthesized brilliantly with Christian theology. The towering figure there, the one everyone sort of reacted to or built upon, was Thomas Aquinas.
Aquinas, right. He'd constructed this vast intellectual cathedral, integrating Aristotle into Christian thought, a massive achievement.
A truly massive achievement, an attempt to create this unified system where reason and faith work together, where you could understand God, the universe, humanity, all within one logical framework.
But even as scholasticism was hitting its peak, the world outside the universities, the 14th century itself, was just incredibly chaotic.
Teetering on the brink, absolutely. And that environment, that pressure and crisis, it directly shaped Occam's thinking, made it radical.
You can almost feel that tension. What kind of chaos are we talking about?
Well, first off, huge political and religious power struggles. We're talking serious, often violent clashes between the papacy, which claimed authority over everything, spiritual and temporal.
Right, the Pope versus the kings.
Exactly. Versus secular rulers, kings, emperors who were fighting back, trying to assert their own independence and power. It wasn't just abstract debate. It was about land, money, loyalty, real power.
High stakes.
Extremely high stakes. And alongside that political turmoil, there were these major intellectual shifts happening. People were really starting to question the boundaries. Where does religious faith stop and human reason begin?
Can reason explain everything about faith?
Yeah.
Or are some things just beyond reason?
Precisely. That questioning created this very dynamic, sometimes pretty unsettling intellectual climate. It was ripe for reevaluation, ripe for someone like Ockham to come along and shake things up.
And if all that wasn't enough, you also had massive social and environmental disasters.
Yeah.
Plagues, famine.
Yes. While Ockham himself died just before the Black Death really peaked, The general atmosphere of recurrent epidemics, famine, the sheer fragility of life that was the backdrop.
That constant sense of crisis must have had a profound psychological impact.
Absolutely. It complicated everything, pushing people to find new ways to understand a world where old certainties just seem to be crumbling.
So Occam wasn't just thinking in isolation, he was right in the thick of it.
Exactly. He wasn't some detached academic. He was an innovator emerging directly from this chaos. His philosophy wasn't born in a vacuum. It was a response, a reaction to the pressures, the uncertainties, the intellectual ferment of his time. Understanding that context is absolutely key to grasping why his ideas were so radical, so disruptive.
That makes perfect sense. Knowing the turbulence helps us appreciate just how audacious his thinking really was. So, okay, how did this man, William, from this small village, Ockham, actually rise to challenge the foundations of his age? Let's get into his life story a bit.
Well, the first thing to say is that surprisingly, we don't have a ton of detailed biographical information, especially about his early years.
Really? For such a major figure?
Yeah, unlike some others. What we know is pieced together from various records, contemporary accounts, later interpretations. It's a bit of a puzzle.
Which almost makes his impact seem even greater, doesn't it? That his ideas shone through despite the biographical gaps.
It does. We know he was born around 1287 in Ockham, Surrey, hence the name, obviously.
Pretty straightforward.
And from fairly early on, he pursued a religious path. He joined the Franciscan order.
The Franciscans. Known for their emphasis on poverty, right? And sometimes clashing with the church hierarchy because of it.
Exactly. They were a mendicant order, often focused on direct engagement with people, which sometimes put them at odds with the more established, wealthier parts of the church. And then he went on to study at Oxford.
Which, as you said, was this major center for scholastic thought, the heart of the intellectual action.
The absolute heart. And he wasn't just soaking it up passively. He was deeply engaged with Aristotle, trying to synthesize it with Christian doctrine, just like Aquinas and others had done. He was immersed in the very tradition he'd later critiqued so powerfully.
So he knew it inside out. That probably made his critique much sharper.
Definitely. He understood the system he was challenging. Now, here's where his life takes a really dramatic turn, the part that directly fuels his most radical thinking, the early 1320s.
Okay, what happened?
He ends up at the papal court, which, interestingly, wasn't in Rome at that time, but in Avignon, France, a controversial base for the papacy.
The Avignon papacy, right. A whole saga in
A
itself.
whole saga. And there, in Avignon, Occam finds himself in serious disagreement with the Pope, Pope John XXII.
And this wasn't just a friendly academic debate, I take it.
Not at all. This was a fundamental clash over power, political and theological. Pope John XXII was trying to really centralize papal control, extend his authority over secular rulers, and even clamp down on things like the Franciscan ideal of absolute poverty.
Which Occam, as a Franciscan, would have felt strongly about.
Passionately. Occam directly challenged the Pope's claims to absolute power, especially in worldly matters. He questioned the Pope's financial dealings, his political interventions. He argued papal authority had limits set by God's law and the rights of rulers and individuals.
Wow. Taking on the Pope directly. That's incredibly bold.
Incredibly bold, especially when Pope John declared the Franciscan doctrine of absolute poverty, the idea that Christ and the apostles own nothing individually or in common, to be heretical. Occam believed this poverty was central to Christ's example. He couldn't accept the Pope's ruling.
So it became a direct confrontation. What happened to Occam?
The consequences were severe. He was summoned to Avignon, essentially put under house arrest for years, facing interrogations about his writings, his support for Franciscan poverty, his views on papal power.
That must have been incredibly stressful. His freedom, maybe even his life, on the line.
Very much so. He realized he wasn't going to get a fair hearing. The condemnation was likely. So in 1328, he made a break for it. He fled Avignon under the cover of darkness.
Fled. Where did he go?
He sought refuge with Emperor Louis V of Bavaria. Louis was Pope John XXII's major political rival. They were locked in this bitter power struggle. So Occam essentially went over to the Pope's biggest enemy.
Incredible. Trading the academic life for life as a fugitive, protected by an emperor at odds with the Pope.
Exactly. And that experience, the conflict, the flight, the exile, the need to justify resistance to papal authority, it absolutely forged his political philosophy. It wasn't abstract anymore. It was deeply personal and political.
So his own fight for intellectual freedom became the bedrock for his ideas about limiting power and defending rights.
You've got it perfectly. That period in exile, protected by the emperor, probably in Munich, was crucial. It gave him the freedom to develop and write down his most challenging ideas, especially on politics, without the immediate threat of papal censorship.
And his Lego life, how did it end?
He died around 1347, likely still in exile in Munich, though the records are a bit unclear on the exact location. The cause isn't known for sure, but given the time period, with plagues becoming more frequent leading up to the Black Death,
Right.
it's generally assumed he died of natural causes, perhaps related to one of those epidemics. But his life, even with the biographical gaps, left this absolutely revolutionary mark on Western thought.
What a life, and what a legacy. Okay, let's dive into that legacy, the core of his philosophical views. These were the ideas that caused so much controversy, but also had such a lasting impact.
Right. Let's start with metaphysics, and specifically the huge medieval debate known as the problem of universals.
Universals. Okay, refresh my memory. What's the core question there?
The question is basically, do general concepts, things like humanity, redness, catness, justice, do these things actually exist as real entities, independent of our minds? Or are they just names, just mental labels we use?
So is there a real thing called catness floating around somewhere that all individual cats participate in? Or is cat just a word we use to group together Fluffy and Tom and all the other individual cats we see?
Exactly that. Now, the dominant view before Ockham, the view of scholastic realists like Aquinas and Duns Scotus, was that, yes, these universals are real.
They actually exist.
In some way, yes. Maybe as forms, maybe as essences within things. They believed humanity was a real shared reality that made individuals human.
Okay, so that was the mainstream. But Ockham, being Ockham.
He flipped it completely. He championed what's called nominalism, from the Latin nomen, meaning name.
Nominalism, so universals are just names.
Precisely. His argument was revolutionary. Universals have no real existence outside the mind. They aren't real things out there. They are simply names, mental concepts, tools the mind creates to group individuals based on perceived similarities.
Wow. So humanity isn't a real essence, it's just a label we invented after seeing lots of individual humans and noticing they shared certain features.
Exactly. He insisted they are linguistic and mental tools, cognitive shortcuts, not ontological realities. This is a radical simplification of metaphysics.
How so? What did it simplify?
Well, for Occam, the fundamental unit of reality is always the individual. This specific person, that particular tree. Only individuals truly exist. Any generality, any universal, is a mental construction built upon observing those individuals.
So all the complex debates the realists had about the nature of universals, how they relate to particulars, Occam basically said, you're debating about things that don't actually exist.
Essentially, yes. He saw it as unnecessary clutter, a multiplication of entities. His nominalism aimed to sweep away these abstract layers and ground metaphysics much more firmly in experience and observation of individuals.
That's huge. It really shifts the focus from abstract essences to concrete reality.
It does, and it forces us to think, even today, if our categories, scientific, social, whatever, are ultimately just names, just mental constructs, what does that mean for their truth or objectivity? It's a really profound question about how we structure our understanding of the world.
It really is. And speaking of simplifying, of cutting away the unnecessary, this leads us straight to his most famous idea, Occam's razor.
The razor, probably his most enduring legacy, known far beyond philosophical circles. It's become a fundamental principle in science, problem-solving, everywhere.
And the classic formulation, the Latin,
Entia non sunt multiplicanda praeter necessitatem.
which translates to,
Entities should not be multiplied unnecessarily. Or, perhaps more practically, don't make things more complicated than they need to be.
keep it simple, essentially.
Keep it simple. The principle advises that when you're faced with competing explanations for something, you should generally favor the one that makes the fewest assumptions, the one that doesn't invent unnecessary complexities or entities. It's about intellectual economy, parsimony.
So if one theory explains gravity using known forces, and another needs to invent 5 new invisible forces to do the same job.
Occam's razor says, all else being equal, go with the simpler one, the one that doesn't multiply entities without necessity.
And this was a direct challenge to the way scholastic philosophy often worked, right? With all its layers and distinctions.
A massive challenge. Scholasticism could sometimes feel like it was building these incredibly intricate structures with numerous intermediary causes, distinctions upon distinctions. Occam was advocating for a cleaner, more direct, minimalist approach. Strip away the baggage.
It's amazing how powerful such a simple rule can be. It's not just for philosophy, is it? It's a guide for thinking, period.
Absolutely. It promotes clarity, efficiency, and forces you to justify every assumption you make. A really powerful tool for cutting through confusion.
Okay, so we've seen how he simplified reality with nominalism and how he advocated simplifying explanations with the razor. What about how we know things? His epistemology.
His theory of knowledge was equally groundbreaking, shifting the focus firmly onto experience and sensory perception.
So knowledge starts with the senses, not with innate ideas or pure reason.
Primarily, yes. For Ockham, the process begins with what he called intuitive cognition. This is the direct, immediate awareness you have of an individual thing through your senses. You see this specific book, you feel this particular heat. It's undeniable knowledge of existing individuals.
Okay, so I see the individual tree. Then what? How do we get the concept of tree?
That's the next step. Abstractive cognition. Your mind takes those individual sensory inputs from seeing many different trees and forms a concept, a mental representation, like the concept tree.
Ah, but based on his nominalism, that concept tree isn't a real thing itself.
Exactly. It's a mental construct, a fiction, or an intention in his terms. It's derived from the common properties you observed in all those individual trees. But the concept itself doesn't exist independently out there. It's a tool, a name, a useful mental shortcut based on your experiences.
So knowledge is built up from individual experiences, and our general concepts are mental summaries of those experiences.
That's a great way to put it. And this strong emphasis on sensory data, this suspicion of abstract entities not grounded in experience, and his focus on logical analysis really makes him a key forerunner of modern empiricism. Think Locke, Hume.
Yeah.
They owe a lot to the groundwork Ockham laid.
And also analytic philosophy, with its focus on logic and language.
Definitely. He cleared away so much metaphysical underbrush, making space for a philosophy focused on clarity, experience, and logical rigor. He was centuries ahead in many ways.
That connection to modern thought is fascinating. Let's talk more about that role of language and logic. You said it was pivotal for him.
Absolutely pivotal. For Ockham, language wasn't just a tool to describe reality. It was deeply intertwined with how we know reality and understand being itself. His work significantly simplified medieval logic and laid foundations for modern philosophy of language.
How did he simplify logic? What was different about his approach?
Well, a lot of medieval logic, following Aristotle, focused on categorical logic dealing with classes of things like all S or P, no S or P.
Classifying things into boxes.
Right. But Ockham, because he believed only individuals are truly real, shifted the focus more towards propositional logic. This deals with the truth or falsity of whole statements or propositions and how they connect logically, if P, then Q.
So it's less about sorting things and more about analyzing the logical structure of our claims about things.
Yeah. Exactly. It's a move towards a more formal, analytical approach. He also argued that terms in language primarily refer to individuals. When you say Socrates, it refers to that individual man. Even a general term like man in a proposition ultimately stands for individual men like Socrates, Plato, etc., not some abstract universal manness.
So language points to individuals or collections of individuals, not to abstract concepts floating somewhere.
That was his view. Universal terms are convenient labels for groups of similar individuals, essential for communication, but they don't hook onto some separately existing universal reality. This really streamlined the understanding of meaning and reference in logic. It was all part of that drive for clarity and ontological parsimony.
It all connects back to that core idea. Focus on the individual, avoid unnecessary entities, even in logic and language.
Precisely. And this same drive, this same demand for simplicity and clarity, extended even into his theology, which, as you can imagine, got him into quite a bit of hot water.
Theology in the 14th century that was playing with fire, wasn't it?
It certainly could be. Occam's theological views were definitely controversial because they deviated quite sharply from the established scholastic lines, especially Aquinas' synthesis.
How so? Did he disagree about God's existence?
No. He believed God's existence could be known through reason, arguing from the need for a first cause, an absolutely simple being. But he emphasized God's utter simplicity. Unlike some scholastics who posited complex structures or multiple distinct attributes within God, Occam insisted God was radically simple. No need to multiply divine entities or qualities unnecessarily.
Following his own razor, even when talking about God.
Exactly. And perhaps even more controversially, he stressed God's absolute and free will.
What did that mean, practically?
It meant God isn't bound by anything, not by logic, not by pre-existing moral laws, not even by what seems rational to us. For Occam, something is good because God wills it. His will is the ultimate source of reality and morality. God could have commanded stealing, for instance, and it would have been good simply because he commanded it. His power is truly absolute, not constrained by human concepts of rationality or necessity.
Wow. That's a radical form of voluntarism. It makes God seem almost unpredictable, or at least beyond human comprehension.
It definitely emphasizes the limits of human reason in understanding God's choices. It also reinforces God's simplicity and freedom, no need for complex rationalizations of his actions. He acts because he wills to act. Full stop.
And this tied into his ideas about faith and reason.
Yes. Ockham was very keen on clearly separating what reason could prove from what must be accepted purely on faith. He thought religious dogmas, like the Trinity, the Incarnation, should be accepted based on revelation, as long as they didn't directly contradict reason. But he warned against trying too hard to rationally prove every mystery of faith. That, he felt, strained reason inappropriately and actually weakened faith by trying to turn it into philosophy.
Keep faith and reason in their own lanes, so to speak. Respect the limits of human understanding when dealing with the divine.
That's a good way to put it. Don't multiply metaphysical explanations for things that ultimately belong to the realm of faith. It's that consistent drive for clarity and avoiding needless complexity again.
This picture emerges of someone deeply committed to intellectual honesty, even when it led him to challenge the most powerful institutions and ideas of his day. Which brings us back to his political philosophy.
Yes, and this is where his philosophical principles hit the real world with incredible force. His political thought grew directly out of that intense 14th century clash between the popes in Avignon and secular rulers like Emperor Louis IV.
The battle for ultimate authority.
Exactly. And Ockham jumped right into the fray, intellectually speaking. He mounted a powerful challenge to the idea of absolute papal authority.
He wasn't an anarchist, though. He believed in authority.
Oh, yes. He believed in legitimate authority, both spiritual and temporal. But he argued strongly that papal power was limited by God's law, limited to its proper spiritual sphere. He absolutely rejected the Pope's claims to universal dominion over secular rulers and temporal affairs.
So the Pope is head of the church, spiritually, but not the boss of kings in their own kingdoms.
That's the gist of it. And even more radically for the time, he strongly defended the legitimacy of secular rulers and argued for the role of the people of the community in establishing and consenting to government.
The people. In the 14th century, that sounds incredibly modern.
It really does. He advocated for shared power, for checks and balances to prevent tyranny, whether from a king or a pope. He believed authority ultimately comes from God, yes, but it's delegated through the community for the common good.
So if a ruler, even the Pope, acts tyrannically, abuses their power.
Ockham argued that the community had the right to resist, even depose, such a ruler. His thinking points towards ideas we now associate with social contract theory, consent of the governed, even popular sovereignty. It's quite remarkable.
How did a medieval friar even arrive at these ideas, living under such a powerful papacy?
Well, his own experience of being persecuted by Pope John XXII certainly played a huge role. But philosophically, it stemmed from his focus on individuals. If only individuals are real, then communities are collections of individuals, and authority must ultimately serve those individuals in their common good, not some abstract notion of absolute power vested in one person.
It's amazing how his metaphysics connects to his politics.
It's a remarkably consistent system. And these political ideas, needless to say, were seen as incredibly dangerous by the church hierarchy. They fueled the conflict that led to his exile and had a profound influence on later political thought, contributing to the Reformation, the rise of nation-states, and constitutional ideas.
His courage was just immense, facing down that kind of power.
Truly remarkable. And his influence, as we touched on, extended far beyond his own time and controversies. His work really did change the trajectory of Western thought.
How would you summarize that broader impact? How did he transform the intellectual landscape?
Well, first, he fundamentally shifted scholasticism. His nominalism and his razor forced a move away from complex abstractions towards a more analytical, empirical, and methodologically rigorous approach. He made philosophers justify the existence of every entity they talked about.
And the razor itself became a tool for, well, everyone, almost.
Absolutely. It became and remains a core principle in scientific method and rational inquiry generally. The preference for simpler, more testable explanations owes a huge debt to Ockham. It's about intellectual efficiency and honesty.
And you mentioned his role as a pioneer of modern philosophy. That seems key.
Hugely key. His emphasis on individual experience, his skepticism about universals, his demand for clarity, this directly paved the way for empiricists like Locke and Hume. Even rationalists like Descartes, seeking clear and distinct ideas, were arguably influenced by Occam's drive for fundamental simplicity. He helped create the intellectual climate for the scientific revolution.
And his focus on logic and language seems like a direct line to 20th century philosophy.
A very direct line. His work on propositional logic, meaning, and reference makes him a clear precursor to analytic philosophy, with its intense focus on linguistic analysis and logical precision. He gave philosophy tools to dissect language and concepts in a new way.
And finally, those political ideas, their legacy.
They fed into the long, slow process of secularization, helping to define separate spheres for church and state. His arguments for limited government, accountability, and the role of the community laid important groundwork for modern democratic theory. The debates he started about the source and limits of power are still relevant.
So, wrapping it all up, William of Ockham emerges as this truly radical, incredibly systematic thinker. He pushed boundaries everywhere: metaphysics, epistemology, language, theology, politics.
And his own life, that struggle against authority, that forced exile, wasn't just a backdrop. It was integral to the development of his most challenging ideas. It's a story of intellectual courage.
His whole system seems driven by this relentless quest for clarity, avoiding unnecessary assumptions, grounding knowledge in experience, analyzing language, simplifying concepts of God, defining the limits of power.
And the impact was immense, shaping not just the Middle Ages, but the foundations of modern science and philosophy. He didn't just teach us what to think. He profoundly influenced how we think, urging us towards clarity, simplicity, and rigor.
He really did. It makes you think. As you, our listener, navigate this incredibly complex world, overloaded with information, how could Occam's razor help you find clarity? How can it help you cut through the clutter and focus on what's essential?
And maybe also consider this. How do those 700-year-old struggles Occam engaged in about the limits of authority, the balance of power, the rights of individuals and communities, how do they still echo today? In our own debates about governance, freedom, and power, are we still asking Occam's questions?